Welcome to ForexTV.com. Today's Wednesday, July 9th. I'm Remy Hookey for New York Forex Market Buzz. The U.S. dollar is lower against the majors after seeing gains in yesterday's session. On the fundamental front, news that Iran test-fired a long-range missile is weighing on the U.S. currency. Overnight, Iran test-fired 9 missiles, some of which were capable of reaching Israel. Heightened tensions also pushed crude oil prices higher, with the benchmark contract rebounding after a 2-day sell-off. Now let's take a look at the latest headlines from the CEP News Desk. It was a fairly quiet morning in the North American session, with the release of moderating Canadian housing starts for June and several lower-tier U.S. indicators. The European session saw plenty of comments from ECB speakers following up on the bank's rate hike last week. According to data released by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, Canada's annual rate of housing starts fell to 217,800 in June from a revised figure of 227,700 starts in May. And the EIA reported that crude oil supplies were down a steep 5.9 million barrels in the week ending July 4th. Meanwhile, inventories of gasoline rose 0.9 million barrels in the week, while distillate stocks jumped 1.8 million. And in the U.S. weekly mortgage applications report, which moved higher last week, they were up by 7.5% week over week. The portion of fixed-rate mortgages rose 5.7%, while those opting for variable rates rose by 26.4%. Meanwhile, things were a little busier overseas, and delivering testimony before the European Parliament, ECB President Jean-Claude Trichet reaffirmed that inflation risks had intensified and that the recent rate hike combined with the current monetary policy stance would contribute to price stabilization and anchoring inflation expectations. He also added that it's important for price setters to understand the ECB's commitment to price stability. Meanwhile, final Q1 growth in the Eurozone was unexpectedly revised down to a 0.7% quarterly rise and 2.1% annual growth rate. And the German trade balance contracted further in May with a decline from 18.8 billion euros to 14.4 billion euros. And in France, the trade deficit widened to 4.738 billion euros in May. Over in the UK, Nationwide reported that British consumer confidence declined further in June, with the headline index slipping to 63 from April's 69 level. And the ONS reported that the UK trade deficit narrowed to 7.494 billion sterling in May after a slight widening in April. This afternoon, I'm joined by Omer Esiner, Senior Market Analyst at Ruesch International. Good afternoon, Omer.
Good afternoon.
Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're seeing the U.S. dollar weaker in today's session against the majors on geopolitical concerns as well as the bounce in crude prices. Since the beginning of the week, we have been seeing range-bound trading in the dollar majors, with some support yesterday coming from Bernanke's comments. But there has not been one clear fundamental driver. So technically, if you could give us your short-term outlook for euro dollar.
Well, for euro dollar, I think it's going to continue to take its cue from geopolitical factors for the rest of the session. Given the dearth of economic data for the better part of this week, I think traders have had no choice but to look to outside influences, and the events overnight in Iran, as you mentioned, served to boost oil prices, which had been trading at about a 2-week low yesterday. So higher energy prices have generally translated into a weaker dollar, and I think that's been the main driver of the dollar sell-off throughout today's session. Going forward, though, I think we're going to start to look a little bit more back onto fundamental factors. We do have another speech by Mr. Bernanke tomorrow, weekly jobless claims tomorrow, and then, of course, some data on the trade and consumer confidence front on Friday. So the short-term outlook, I think, will probably be more range-bound trading unless we see any more surprises from either Bernanke or the data for the rest of this week.
Well, Omer, looking ahead to tomorrow's session, the BOE meeting has started, so let's take a look at the sterling. We're seeing the currency higher against the U.S. dollar, and the rate decision will come out tomorrow morning. So while the UK economic outlook continues to deteriorate, the BOE is expected to hold at 5%. So for cable against both the euro as well as the U.S. dollar, what is your forecast and what's your analysis of the key drivers?
Well, you're right. I think the Bank of England is forecast to hold rates steady at 5%. While I think they would like to lower interest rates, they simply can't given the elevated state of inflation in the UK. So I think ultimately that's going to push the pound lower. It's going to keep it under pressure both against the dollar and against sterling. While steady interest rates would have otherwise been a positive for the pound, I think at this point the market really views the Bank of England's inability to address the slowing economy with easier monetary policy as a net negative. So going forward, I expect sterling to remain under pressure both against the U.S. dollar and against the euro.
Okay, Omar, now that we've covered sterling as well as the euro, let's take a quick look at the Japanese yen. Dollar yen is trading at session lows, hovering around the 107 level in afternoon trade. But if you could give us your forecast for the yen against the U.S. dollar, and also while we're at it, for the yen crosses.
Well, the yen, I think, has gotten a bit of a boost from the rise in geopolitical concerns and the subsequent sell-off in equities, stocks down at this point near lows of the day as a result of, again, those geopolitical concerns and the spike in energy prices. So I think that correlation between stocks and the yen continues. As long as we see equities remain under pressure, then I think the yen should continue its upward bias against both the dollar and against the euro. I think the one possibility for a little bit of a dollar rally would be in some more encouraging comments tomorrow from Mr. Bernanke or from some upside surprises to the data on Friday. If that's the case, and I think equities could probably bounce a little bit, and I think that would definitely help out the dollar against the yen, and I think the yen would definitely suffer against the euro in such a scenario as well.
Well, Omar, while we're taking a closer look at crude oil prices as well as the broader market, let's shift our focus over to the commodity currencies of the Aussie dollar as well as the CAD. Dollar CAD is consolidating after weakness earlier in the session, and Aussie dollar remains up at the upper range of today's highs. But fundamentally and technically, what is your forecast and strategy for the loonie as well as the Aussie dollar going forward?
Well, the Aussie, I think, is a little bit of a special case given the fact that we've seen some disappointing domestic data out of Australia over the last couple of sessions. That has weighed on expectations for an interest rate hike by the Reserve Bank, and I think that will ultimately keep the Australian dollar under a little bit of pressure. Tomorrow we do have some key jobs data out of Australia. If we do see another negative print of the employment number there, then I think certainly that would add to doubts about the ability of the Reserve Bank to raise interest rates, and I think, like I said, that should keep the Australian dollar under pressure despite what commodities do. The Canadian dollar is a little bit different. I think that will take its cue more closely from what happens in commodity markets. Oil back above 140, back towards $145 a barrel would certainly bode well for the Canadian dollar.
Okay, Omar, thank you very much for joining me this afternoon, and thank you very much for insight and analysis into the Forex marketplace.
Thanks for having me.
This has been your Forex Market Buzz with Omar Esiner, Senior Market Analyst at Ruesch International. I'm Remy Hokie. Join us later this afternoon, 4 p.m. exchange, right here on ForexTV.com.